So we are starting the program. Is it okay, sir?
That's good. Thank you.
Okay.
Good afternoon to all the participants and everyone who are watching us from across the world. I would like to welcome you to this inaugural Genocides in Southeast Asia lecture series organized by the Council for Global Cooperation. My name is Yash Singh, and I'm a research associate working in the Cold War Vortex at the CTC. The Council for Global Cooperation is an international, non-partisan forum aimed at tackling global issues that shape our modern world through independent research, analysis, and open dialogue. The CTC serves as a platform for extensive research, commentary, and analysis that promotes global cooperation. The major projects and pressing themes which we focus on are genocide, Holocaust and disaster studies, foreign policy, Cold War studies, and studies on the Third World. We believe in creating a platform to engage and curate ideas and debates on the most pressing global themes and challenges. We aim to think global by encouraging greater public participation. Now, I would request Samava Basu, President of the CTC, to speak a few words on our newly launched initiative, Genocides in Southeast Asia. Samava.
Thank you so much, Yash. And firstly, I would like to say thank you to Professor Cribb for accepting our invitation. This is the series which we started. I won't be speaking a lot like today, as our speaker is Professor Cribb. So I just wanted to briefly tell about this initiative. So our CGC has a vertex named Genocide, Holocaust, and Disaster Studies. And we have launched this program, Genocides in Southeast Asia, with our partner organization, Development Study Club, Indonesia. And we aim to cover the genocide's history and the history of atrocities which are genocidal in nature that has occurred in Indonesia, that has occurred in Southeast Asia, from the Indonesian massacre to from Japanese war crimes during Second World War to Indonesian massacre to even modern day Rohingya crisis. So this is a long-term research program which we have launched, and to also enlighten the audience of CGC as well as the audience across world, and our members of DSC had also requested us if we could make this research program more insightful by adding a lecture series to it, and which was quite right. And because lectures and virtual medium is always the best to reach out to people in modern world. And keeping this in mind, we had started this lecture series, and we aim to cover the genocidal history of Southeast Asia, and also the atrocities that has been going in the region at the moment. So yeah, this is our plan. And so the topic of Indo-Pacific is quite very interesting, and has been a very modern hot topic in the contemporary global events. But very few are aware of the Southeast Asia as the genocidal hotbed during the Cold War. When we talk about the political developments in this region, we tend to forget these atrocities which had been part of the region's history, and had to some extent always been the region's it has impacted the state making and the politics of the region. Unfortunately, we are unable to cover the other genocides issues at the moment because it is not always about time, but there are certain factors to be taken in consideration. So we won't be able to cover the genocides in Asia or the other regions of Indo-Pacific. But yeah, as I mentioned that genocides in Southeast Asia, since this region has always been a hotbed of the Cold War studies. So we thought of starting this initiative from Southeast Asia, and we aim to cover it um, further to other regions as well, hoping so. And I would also like to thank Professor Robert Cribb for suggesting us the topic before the 1945, because we were planning to start the event from the Indonesian massacre. But it is thanks to Professor that he had suggested that it is very it would be very important if we could also maybe consider the Japanese war crimes in the region, which was a prelude to the Cold War. And so we decided to start from Japanese war crimes, and we aim and as well as hope that we are able to reach out to audiences and make this our research program as impactful as possible. And without further delays, yes, so I would like to end my note. Yeah, over to you, Yash.
Well, thank you very much, Sumava, and thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming along today to listen to my lecture, and thank you also for your indulgence. Sumava did ask me to talk about genocides in Southeast Asia, but because my current research is on Japanese war crimes, I suggested that that might be an interesting alternative topic. So it goes a little bit earlier than you had planned, but nonetheless, the issue of reconciliation after war crimes, after atrocities, is one of the pressing issues in international affairs today. And so I want to talk today about the history of reconciliation through the lens of the post-war reckoning with Japan for the war crimes that Japanese forces committed in both in the Sino-Japanese War of 1937 to 1945 and the Second World War in Southeast Asia, running from 1941 to 1945. These days, if you ask people about what Japan has done, excuse me, by way of reckoning with for the crimes that its soldiers committed, there's a general impression that Japan has failed to meet its obligations, and that it has shown bad faith. But what I want to suggest today is that our understanding of what is needed has changed over the decades since the Second World War. And so I want to discuss how those changes came about and just what those changes are, what they mean, and what their strengths and weaknesses might be. So as many of you will know, in mid-1937, low-level hostilities in Japanese-occupied parts of China escalated into full-scale war. The Sino-Japanese War was then fought on the Asian mainland with hundreds of thousands of casualties, at least. The total number of deaths goes into the millions, and the scale of the conflict and also the atrocities that took place as part of it led the United States to place increasingly tough sanctions on Japan with the aim of getting it to withdraw from China. The Japanese leadership decided not to bow to that pressure, and instead to launch a dramatic attack on Pearl Harbor and on Southeast Asia in December 1941. So that attack then triggered the American declaration of war and the start of the Asia-Pacific theatre of the Second World War. The war went on until 1945, when it was ended by the American bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and by the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. Those two factors, excuse me, led Japan to surrender. Now, during the war, Japanese military forces committed many war crimes. There were massacres of civilians, And the most serious of those were in Nanjing in late 1937, early 1948, and in Manila in early 1945. There were many smaller killings of civilians and of captured soldiers. They used their prisoners of war as forced laborers in sometimes appalling conditions. And at a more individual level, there were many executions, there were many beatings, there was torture of people who were suspected of plotting against Japanese rule. There were some less common crimes, medical experiments, cannibalism. These were not general, but they took place. And there were also some actions which are now regarded as war crimes, but which were not considered to be war crimes at the time. Most notably, the forcible recruitment of women for as prostitutes in military comfort stations. Now, how did it? After the war, many Japanese soldiers were put on trial for the crimes that they had committed. But how did this happen? Well, until the late 19th century, there was very little regulation of warfare. War was governed by what was known as belligerent rights, which meant that commanders could decide to do almost anything if they considered it to be a matter of military necessity. And soldiers were generally given freedom to kill, to rape, to plunder, as they wished. It was never the case that they were brought to trial by the opposing side, and it was very rare for them to be brought to trial by their own side. However, in the late 19th century, the idea began to develop of a mutual obligation between so-called civilized powers to avoid what was thought of as needless acts of violence and destruction in wartime. So out of this idea of mutual interest and mutual obligation, there emerged a number of rules. So, for instance, in the conduct of war, false surrender or perfidy was regarded as a war crime. The use of weapons that caused long-term maiming of victims rather than immediate death, dum-dum bullets, for instance, expanding bullets, was also considered a war crime. There was a requirement that prisoners of war, be treated on more or less the same basis as the troops of the country that captured them, the country that held them. And there was even the start of some rules about the decent treatment of civilians, although civilians didn't feature very strongly in those international rules. Now, these international law at this stage, when it came to war, was very much reciprocal. It was a gentleman's agreement between great powers that considered themselves civilized. It wasn't a matter of criminal law, and it certainly wasn't a matter of universal moral standards, because everything that was prohibited in international law was still permitted in domestic law, in civil law, and particularly, and this was particularly important, in the suppression of rebellions in the European colonies, in the Western colonies. So that was the situation up until the start of the First World War, Second World War. But during the Second World War, the scale of Nazi atrocities in Europe led to an international legal effort to achieve some kind of a broader accountability for atrocities in wartime. Now, the main agent producing this system for accountability was an organization called the United Nations War Crimes Commission. Now, the organization that we know as the United Nations didn't exist at this time. But the United Nations used to be called the United Nations Organization, and it grew out of the wartime Western Alliance, which was very often during the war called the United Nations. So when we read about the United Nations War Crimes Commission, it's not a UN organization, it's an allied commission, which was intended both to collect information, to collect evidence about war crimes, and to prepare the legal basis for prosecution after the war. So there were really two considerations at work within the War Crimes Commission. The first was to reduce the scope of belligerent rights, to say soldiers and their commanders are not permitted to do absolutely anything that they want. If they go too far, they will be held accountable. The second underlying concern of the War Crimes Commission was to hold individuals responsible rather than countries. This idea was, to a significant extent, a lesson drawn from the aftermath of the First World War, when the Treaty of Versailles had punished Germany very heavily, claiming that it was that it bore responsibility for the aggression in the First World War, and putting very serious penalties on it. There was a widespread belief that this victimization of Germany as a nation at the end of the First World War had paved the ground for the rise of Hitler. And so the idea was, if you could focus on the individuals who'd committed war crimes and separate them from the nation, then you would achieve justice, but you would avoid sowing the seeds of a Third World War. And so in July 1945, after the surrender of Germany, but just before the surrender of Japan, the United States, Britain, and China issued what was called the Potsdam Declaration, in which they said, we do not intend that the Japanese nation shall be enslaved, or that the Japanese shall be enslaved as a race or destroyed as a nation. But stern justice shall be meted out to all war criminals, including those who have visited cruelties on our prisoners. So you can see in that statement the idea, Japan may well be penalized, but it's not going to be the main target. The main target will be the people who actually committed the war crimes. Now, this promise in the Potsdam Agreement, the Potsdam Declaration rather, was the basis for a massive post-war trial endeavor in which individual Japanese, sometimes as individuals, sometimes in small groups, were brought before the courts to hear charges that they had committed war crimes. Now, many of you will know of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. It's also known as the Tokyo Tribunal or the Tokyo Trial. It ran from 1946 to 1948. 11 of the Allied powers sat on the bench and took part in the prosecution of 28 Japanese defendants, 28 of Japan's civilian and military leaders who are charged variously with crimes against peace and war crimes. Crimes against peace meant waging aggressive war, in other words, attacking another country, regardless of what might be done in that attack. War crimes were the acts of brutality or excess or atrocity that might have been committed in the course of that attack. So there were two separate concepts. There were around 2,200 trials. They were run by Australia, China, France, the Netherlands, Indies, the Philippines, the United States, and the United Kingdom. There were around 5,700 defendants. The trials took place in around 50 locations. There were also separate trials in the Soviet Union and local trials in China, but unfortunately we don't know very much about those trials. And later on there were also trials in the People's Republic of China. There were comparable trials in Europe at much the same time, but this massive trial effort, 5,700 defendants in Asia, was never followed up, or at least it wasn't followed up until the 1990s, when international criminal tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda were brought into being to prosecute war crimes that had been committed in Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And in 2002, when the International Criminal Court was formed. Now, 2,200 or more trials, which took place in the space of just over 5 years. They've been criticised, as you would expect. They've been criticised because they were quick and dirty. The aim was to endorse Japanese guilt rather than to investigate forensically whether the Japanese were guilty. Some of the judges had been former POWs. Some of the trials depended entirely on affidavits, that is, on sworn statements. So there was no chance for the defendants to cross-question suspects. Some of the trials were very brief. They were over in half a day. We now know that in some trials, there were cases of perjury. There was certainly problematic evidence in some trials. On the other hand, across this huge trial effort, many guilty men were brought to justice. In many of the trials, it was abundantly clear that the person on trial was indeed guilty, and so the guilty verdict that followed was justified. The trials were also criticised for their limited scope. They covered only the period from 1928 to 1945, so nothing earlier, nothing later. They prosecuted only Japanese, or rather only people who'd been subjects of Japan at the start of the war. So that included Koreans and Taiwanese, who had often worked for the Japanese military, sometimes had been members of the Japanese military. They were tried as if they were Japanese citizens, although they had been, at the end of the war, they were removed from the purview of Japanese citizenship. But there was no hint that there could be any trial of soldiers on the Allied side for war crimes. Now, on the whole, there were probably many fewer war crimes, certainly many fewer atrocities on the Allied side, but they were there. There was, however, no attempt to investigate or to prosecute them. The trials were also criticised for being uneven. There were people who escaped either because they had good connections. There were people who escaped because they got out quickly and hid. One of the worst potential war criminals hid in Thailand in a monastery for several years before finally returning to Japan. The perpetrators of Unit 731, the Japanese biological and chemical research station in Manchuria, were not prosecuted. However, as I said, 5,700 were prosecuted, and of those, around 4,600 were found guilty. Around 800 were sentenced to death, although we know that not as many as that were actually executed. The rest were sent to prison. The trial process came to an end mostly by the end of 1949, though Australia continued its trials until 1951. The reason for bringing an end to this trial process was twofold. There was a technical reason and a political reason. At this time, there was a strong belief that you could prosecute war crimes only in time of war. So as long as there was a state of war between Japan and its enemies, then it was okay to prosecute Japanese for war crimes. But as soon as the peace treaty was signed, and it came into force in 1952, then there was a very strong idea it was no longer possible to prosecute war crimes. The second reason was political, and it was the fact of the Cold War. Japan was increasingly important as a partner of the West in the Cold War, and Japanese were increasingly unhappy with the fact that only Japanese in the Asia region, only Japanese had ever been prosecuted for war crimes. There'd been no other prosecutions, but Japanese were still sitting there in jail, even though they were allies of the West. So under the 1952 San Francisco Treaty, there was a deal. Japan, the trials stopped, but Japan recognized all the verdicts that had been brought down so far, and they agreed to keep all convicted war criminals in prison unless and until the powers that had sentenced them agreed that they should be released. So Japan didn't have authority over these prisoners. Nonetheless, by 1958, all those prosecuting powers, those 7 powers, had decided that the time was past for keeping these men in prison, and they were all released. It was partly a consequence of Japanese pressure, partly a consequence of unease because of the fact that only Japanese had been targeted. Germans who had been convicted in much the same process in Europe were also mostly released by this time. Japan also paid reparations to the Philippines, Indonesia, and Burma. It paid a small amount of reparations to prisoners of war and to Dutch internees. And then the end of this formal settlement came in 1956 with another set of trials, just 36 Japanese who were prosecuted in Shenyang, in the People's Republic of China, for war crimes that they had allegedly committed during Japan's occupation of China. But they confessed, and they got very light sentences. The Chinese view at the time was that the Second World War had been launched not by ordinary Japanese, but by Japanese fascists and militarists in the government. And so there was no point in punishing individual soldiers for what had been a crime of the fascist regime, which was now removed from power in Japan. Japan didn't pay reparations to China, but it did provide very substantial development assistance. So by the end of the 1960s, it appeared that the bitterness which Japanese war crimes had caused, had led to in Southeast Asia and East Asia, had significantly evaporated. The Philippine Prime Minister, Elpidio Quirino, gave a full pardon to most of the Japanese war criminals. There had been, in 1946, a motion before the Philippine Congress to make it illegal to say anything nice about Japan. That was the strength of the hostility to Japan in the Philippines. But that bill was never passed, and by the end of the 1950s, the Philippine government, the governments of other parts of Southeast Asia, were busy rebuilding their economic relations with Japan. One of the men convicted in the Tokyo trial, Shigemitsu Mamoru, became Japanese foreign minister, and he publicly acknowledged that he had been a war criminal, and he saw this as simply part of the aftermath of war, something that needed to be resolved in order for Japan and its allies to move on. There is a celebrated story that Mao thanked Japan for its invasion because it was that had made it possible for the Chinese Communist Party to come to power. But although he did make the thanks, it was meant very ironically. One of his rhetorical styles was to thank people who had strengthened the will of the Chinese people to resist its oppressors. So he wasn't actually expressing gratitude to Japan. But in the 1970s, this apparent settlement, this apparent post-war settlement began to unravel, and it unraveled to the extent where these days the tensions between Japan and China over Japan's war crime record are amongst the more important sources of tension in East Asia. So what happened? Well, one thing was that the Holocaust, the Nazi German attempt to exterminate the Jews of Europe, grew in moral stature to become the crime of crimes, to become regarded as the worst of human crimes that had been committed, at least in the 20th century. It had always been regarded as something major, but now it was regarded as uniquely evil. And the German government responded with contrition. It responded with apology. In 1970, the German Chancellor, Willy Brandt, went to Warsaw and fell on his knees in front of a memorial in the what had been the Jewish ghetto. And since then, there has been a constant process of memorialization and public expression of contrition from Germany for its role in the Holocaust. And this German contrition has been held up as an example as a rebuke, rather, to Japan. Even though what Germany was apologizing for was the Holocaust, and there was no such thing, nothing comparable to the Holocaust in Asia. A second thing that happened was that there was an inflation in the public perception of the scale of Japanese war crimes. So make no mistake, the war crimes that Japan committed were terrible. The massacres in Manila and in Nanjing had no real parallels anywhere else in the Second World War. They were truly awful atrocities. But the scale and the awfulness of Japan's war crimes began to be magnified. Iris Chung's 1997 book, The Rape of Nanking, played an important role in this process. But there was also a figure that had been produced in the Tokyo trial, which suggested that 27% of Allied prisoners of war of the Japanese had died in captivity, whereas only 4% of Allied prisoners of war in German hands had died. And that figure turns out to be, in a very limited sense, technically correct, but it's actually quite misleading. And the real comparison is more like 4% on the German side to 7 to 10% on the Japanese side. The total number of Chinese deaths was exaggerated. So there's many examples of claims about Japanese war crimes that went beyond what could be justified historically. And at the same time, Japan's reaction did not help. And Japan had not undertaken anything like the Holocaust, but Japanese responding to this criticism very often pointed to the firebombing of Tokyo, to the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as a way of suggesting that if they were expected to apologize, then the West should also apologize. There were also groups within Japan that simply wanted to deny the group, to deny the accusations, but a much larger group felt that Japan was being unfairly targeted. And this sense of being unfairly targeted gave rise to what I call soft denial, the feeling that the war crimes they took place, but they're perhaps not a big deal. And it was exacerbated by the enshrinement of war criminals in the Yasukuni shrine in Tokyo. It was done in private, it was done in secret, but then the shrine was visited by Japanese prime ministers, which gave the impression that they were endorsing, that they were paying honor to Japanese war criminals. So many things that happened in Japan exacerbated this perception that Japan had been lacking in the contrition that Germany had showed. And then the final thing that happened was that other issues were discovered as war crimes, and especially the issue of comfort women, this forced recruitment of women to work as prostitutes in military brothels. Many of them had been Korean. It's very hard at the moment to tell just what proportion had been Korean, what proportion were Japanese, what proportion came from other places. But crimes against Koreans had been excluded from the post-war trial process because Korea was regarded as part of Japan. It had been conquered by Japan in 1910. Koreans had served in the Japanese army, and so there was no possibility in the war crimes trials for the trial of Japanese for crimes against Koreans. So there was a new issue. The issue of forced laborers from Korea was also very much present. I would say that the comfort women issue remains extremely controversial. Not only do we not know the proportion of nationalities, there's a lot of uncertainty about the degree of coercion. Many of the women who ended up in this work were desperate, so they were, in a sense, they were coerced, but they weren't always kidnapped, but some were kidnapped. And so the total number and the circumstances are very much contested. And as a consequence, Japan as a nation and Japanese in general have been accused of denial and a refusal to apologize. It's a distortion of the general situation in Japan, where there are denialists, some people who deny that there were more than a handful of victims, other people who deny that the scale of the killings, of the atrocities, some who say, well, we were sinned against as well, and some who accept it and who are full of contrition. But what's happening is not just about Japan, not just about Japan and China and what Japan did in China and in Korea. There are other slightly less obvious issues at work, both political and moral. The political first, although I acknowledge that politics is often about morality. First is that China and Korea both have an interest in discrediting Japan as a regional security rival. So a few years ago, when Australia was considering purchasing submarines from Japan, the Chinese foreign minister made a public statement saying that Australia should not do that because of Japan's wartime record. So he brought up events many, many decades ago in order to undermine Japan's defense collaboration with Australia. So there is an element of security strategy involved. It's also likely to be the case that both China and Korea use hostility to Japan as a way of distracting their own people from the shortcomings of those governments. But the moral dimensions of this problem are much more interesting. And there are three moral dimensions that I want to talk about. The first is that during the last quarter or so of the 20th century, we became increasingly conscious of the long-term consequences of political atrocity. It used to be easy to say that, well, it happened in the past, it's over, and we don't need to think about it any longer. But increasingly, researchers became aware of ways in which trauma was passed down within families, within communities, sometimes by telling stories, though often the stories that were told were very much streamlined, and quite often they came in the end from fiction, from films and novels, rather than from personal experience. But nonetheless, they lived within the hearts of generations that had not even been born at the time of the atrocities. People were aware that the experience of witnessing or surviving an atrocity could have a deep psychological effect on individuals and could harm the way in which they were parents. So the next generation suffered by not being brought up with the same affection, perhaps, that they could have expected. Material and physical disadvantage also survives. It can be very hard to recover from massive destruction. It's very easy for perpetrators to say, well, let's not dwell on the past, when the people who were afflicted in the past are still struggling with the consequences of what was done to them. So that was one change in the moral environment. The second was that there was a shift in global affairs to the idea of eternal inherited guilt. Now, this idea had been put forward in 1946 in relation to the Holocaust by a German psychologist called Karl Jaspers, who wrote a book called The Question of German Guilt. And in that book, he said that there are some things that can be forgiven, some things that can be punished, but the Holocaust was such a terrible crime that it will always be on a spot on the souls of Germans. It's a little bit like the Christian doctrine of original sin, under which, according to some Christian doctrines, every believer, even a newborn baby, carries sin by virtue of the sin that is inherited from Adam and Eve. There's a story from of long-term guilt, long-term resentment from Afghanistan, from the beginning of the 20th century. There was a Danish anthropological expedition to the north of Denmark, and they were led by one of the members of the Danish royal family, who had quite a strong interest in anthropology in Central Asia. And it was a special expedition because they had film camera, and they were going to record for the first time the setting up of a camp. And this was spectacular because the tents were lying on the ground, and suddenly they rose up out of the ground, off the ground, and the camp was in place. Now, all of this was done by the women, so it was all arranged that the women would set up the camp, and that this would be filmed by the Danish cameramen. But on the morning when it was to happen, the women had all disappeared. And so the men did the job, and of course it was a mess. After the filming had finished, and it was clearly not a success, one of the old Danes sat down next to one of the old Afghans, and they smoked their pipes for a while, and the Dane said, "That didn't go very well, did it?" The Afghan said, "No, it was a total mess." And the Dane said, "Oh, what do you think went wrong?" He said, "Well, the women weren't there, that's what went wrong." "Well, why weren't the women there?" He said, "Oh, we discovered that the leader of your expedition was Prince Peter of Denmark and Greece. We have rather bad memories of the Greeks." So they had remembered the invasion of Afghanistan by Alexander the Great more than 2,000 years earlier. The idea of vendetta is very common in cultures all around the world: European, Asian, African, American. But one of the aims of modern law had always been to remove legitimacy from the idea of vendetta, to say that it's not okay for you as an individual to take revenge on someone who has harmed your family or your community. It has to be the state that does this. However, when it comes to international crimes, and this has something to do with the ineffectiveness of international law, of course, there has been a tendency to go back to the idea of vendetta, to say that it's that the other side, the people who did this, are guilty, and we should punish them. Now, there's an alternative argument to that, which is, or sorry, it's not an alternative argument. There's an argument about that comes from the American philosopher Michael Sandel. He says that for each of us, when we think about our family or our community or our civilization or our nation, there's good and there's bad. And we have to be willing to accept both the good and the bad. If we feel proud about the things that our nation has achieved, then we also should feel shame about the things that were done by our nation to other people. Now, I think he makes his comment has the problem that he doesn't recognize that celebrating the good in our past doesn't really have any consequences. Acknowledging the bad does have moral consequences for the way we deal with the heirs of the victims. He doesn't deal with that issue. But it seems to me that one crucial reason why people now care so much about Japanese war crimes is that idea that guilt can be inherited and guilt can be eternal. It can be passed on from a generation of Japanese who are now all dead, to their children and their grandchildren, and on to their further descendants. And the third dimension is what I call the democratization of the right to grievance. It used to be the case that it was up to governments to make international agreements. It was up to governments when it came to the peace treaty to demand what they thought they could get away with, what they thought they needed. And it wasn't a matter for ordinary people at all. And the convention, as I suggested before, was that the state's right to grievance pretty much came to an end when the peace treaty was signed, when the war came to an end. And there's many writings in international relations from this earlier period that say, look, no point in holding a grudge against another country, because in the next war, they might be your allies. So, but what has happened is that states have lost their former monopoly of the right to decide what an adequate settlement might be. And the democracy, rather the right to decide what an adequate settlement might be and what an adequate settlement might have been in the past, has been taken into the hands of the public as a whole. So we now have the situation in which ordinary people feel that they have the right to repudiate previous settlements as inadequate. They have the right to say, look, we didn't do enough to demand compensation or apology or contrition or penalties against Japan or whatever other country it might be. and now we are demanding something different. So this, what this has led to is a renegotiability of grievances against perpetrators in the past, and sometimes a demand for renegotiation that's based on not on incorrect or inaccurate views of what actually happened in the previous settlement. If you go on social media, it's not hard to find people who have no idea, for instance, that 5,700 Japanese were put on trial after the Second World War for war crimes, and 4,600 of them were convicted. So the effect of these changes, and by these changes, I mean the democratization of the right to grievance, the new understanding of this long-term effect of atrocity in the past, and the idea of eternal inherited guilt, has led to a situation in which we recognize and accept what I think is a dangerous moral imbalance, in which some groups can't do anything reasonable, at least, to expunge the guilt that their ancestors visited upon them. And this unevenness, this imbalance in moral standing in world affairs, I think is quite dangerous for peace. It's dangerous in part because it becomes very difficult to work out just who are the heirs and who are the successors to the victims, and well, who are the heirs and successors to the victims and the perpetrators. But it's also it's dangerous because it sets up a permanent imbalance. And we would probably be better off in global affairs if there was no one to apologize and no one to forgive. So in this respect, the idea that the past is a different country, they did things differently there, and if we're really human, we should be able to identify with both sides. We should be able to feel the deepest of sympathy, the deepest of sorrow for the victims, and we ought to be asking ourselves of the perpetrators, what is it in them that is like us that might make us also commit atrocities? So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to me, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
So thank you very much, Professor Cribb, for such a comprehensive talk. Now, I hope and I'm sure that this lecture has expanded our knowledge of on pressing themes of genocide and Cold War studies. Now we'll take some questions that were sent to us during the presentation. First of all, I guess, Somova, you can begin with your questions.
So I just wanted to, this is not some kind of question. I just wanted to ask you, Professor, that when, Raphael Lemkin first started to work for the Genocide Convention, so he also faced this, the difficulty where US and, USSR and the other powers didn't want to recognize genocides, and there was difficulty in terminology, the terminology, setting the terminology for the genocides, because their main aim was so that their countries are not blacklisted for the atrocities what they have been doing in the third world nations. So similar is the case. We can, is in the case of this also Japan, we can, if we draw comparison, we can, think. So what do you say? Yeah.
So that's a very interesting and important question. So the simple story of the definition of genocide after the leading up to the Genocide Convention was that there was quite a lot of argument in favor of including political killings as within the definition of genocide, but that this was vetoed by the Soviet Union, which was engaged in the mass killing of its own people on political grounds. And so political killing was excluded. Now, I understand it was more complicated than that, and that other powers were also happy to have political killings excluded from the definition. But it left us with the anomaly that religious persecution falls within the definition of genocide, but political persecution does not. And of course, religion and politics are often very, very closely intertwined, and political identity can often be very much a national identity. In the United States, when people talk about un-American activities, they're using a national term, un-American, to refer to a particular kind of political behavior. So I don't think it's in terms of analysis, it's not a useful distinction, and it doesn't, in my own writing, I include political killings as genocide. But when it comes to Japanese war crimes, I think it's really important to understand that Japan did not commit genocide. Japan did not try to exterminate any ethnic, religious, national, or political group. They stumbled through China and Southeast Asia, committing an enormous number of brutalities against innocent people. So the level of suffering that was caused by Japan was very great. But this was, if you look at those 3 decades between 1930 and 1960 in the world, there was the Second World War in Eastern Europe, which was enormously destructive. There was the Chinese Civil War, the Spanish Civil War. There were the huge purges in China and the Soviet Union under Mao and Stalin. If we start to look at comparisons, probably Japan is just there amongst the others. It doesn't stand out as being exceptional. But for each individual, that should make no difference. Individuals were tortured, individuals were killed. So the question of the broader framework ought not to be quite so important.
Exactly. And do you think, is it ever possible for the world or the international organizations to recognize crimes as genocide? Because as we know, the great powers such as the G4 or the G5, they are not even part of the convention itself. They do not support the they do not support the regulations and the system. So is it ever possible to identify, because it takes a long time. We have seen for the Khmer Rouge how the perpetrators have been, it has taken a long time. And so is it ever possible to, or is genocide would always be a part of scholarly definition and not some kind of definition that to be taken by the UN and the other organizations?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. And I suppose the issue is whether we make the most of an extremely flawed international system, one that doesn't bring to account some of the worst perpetrators, and feel pleased that at least a few of the perpetrators are indeed brought to justice. I think that the way in which great powers avoid being brought to account for what they have done is a huge problem in international affairs. But I don't think that we'd be better off if we had no rules, if we had no laws at all, because there is always, I think, some possibility that the stronger the precedents, the larger the number of examples that get established in international courts, the more difficult it becomes for great powers to say, well, we're just not paying any attention to that. But I'm not. My hope in this respect is a very slender hope. It's not something that I'm relying on.
Right. So we have one question from a participant. He asks, is the Japanese government willing today to apologize to the Indonesian public, especially related to what they did in Borneo in the 1940s?
So let me explain for others just what happened in Borneo in the 1940s. Borneo was occupied by the Japanese Navy, or Dutch Borneo was occupied by the Japanese Navy, and in, I think, late 1943, when the tide of war had begun to turn against Japan, the naval authorities there were afraid that Borneo would lie on the path of the Allied advance. So there were a lot of rumors that Borneo was going to be one of the places that the Allies would conquer on their way to coming back to, or on their way to attacking Japan. Those rumors also spread amongst the local population. Japanese rule was brutal already, and many people were very much hoping that the Allies would come back. They began to organize to help those Allied forces. The Japanese Navy got wind of what was happening, and they rounded up the elite in Borneo and tried them and executed most of them. Now, there were some war crimes trials at the end of the war for what had happened, but because the members of the Borneo elite had actually been engaged in subversion, and because they had actually been, in some cases, they had actually been tried, there was nothing really unusual nothing illegal in international law. It had catastrophic effect for Borneo. It meant that the elite was removed, and Borneo played a relatively subdued role in the Indonesian national revolution that followed. But there's no special reason why Japan should apologize for those actions in the absence of a more general standard for apologizing for trying rebels, trying subversives.
Right. Thank you. So another question is, using the Chinese and South Korean politics as a reference, how much are the Japanese war crime an issue for those who are not familiar with the Indonesian politics? How much are the Japanese war crimes an issue with the Indonesian political dynamics? I mean, is it invoked by the politicians to gain traction with the public?
So it's a very interesting question, and the answer is that although there is always some relatively superficial recognition of Japanese war crimes in Indonesia, those war crimes are separated politically from contemporary Japan. So there is a great deal of respect and affection for Japan in Indonesia. So people are capable of being without resentment towards present-day Japan, but nonetheless capable of talking about particularly the big thing that Indonesians will mention if they raise an issue from the Japanese occupation is the treatment of the so-called romusha. Romusha is the Japanese word for a laborer, but in Indonesia, it means a forced laborer. It means someone who was either kidnapped or at least deceived into signing up to become a laborer on Japanese military projects. And hundreds of thousands of those, at least tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands, died as a result of disease and starvation and poor treatment while they were working for Japan. But that, I suppose, Indonesians do tend to think that the Japanese occupation is a different era. The Japanese then are not the same as the Japanese now.
So another question is, how the data for the study of Japanese war crimes are collected, and if there's any obstacles in obtaining important archives to complete the research?
That's also a very good question. So after the Second World War, there was a huge investigative effort to try and gather information about Japanese war crimes. So all of the prisoners of war were interviewed as they were released and asked to write about war crimes they had seen. There were war crimes investigations teams that went out into the countryside, followed up rumors of Japanese massacres and rumors of Japanese massacres and tried to find witnesses and information. All members of the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police, were arrested and were investigated for their potential role in war crimes. Now, those investigation records have survived for the British territories, the Australian territories, the Philippines, and the US. Relating especially to the Philippines, the Pacific, and Japan. Some of the records have survived from the Netherlands Indies, but some of them have only recently become available, open to the public, and some are still closed. So there are practical difficulties. French records have been very difficult to access, not because they've necessarily been closed, but it's very difficult to find out where they are. They're not well indexed. Chinese records, as you might know, China sometimes opens, sometimes closes its archives. So there have been relatively few opportunities for people to do research, serious research in Chinese archives about war crimes that Japanese committed in China. That said, Japanese war crimes are much better documented than any other set of atrocities in this era, with the exception of the Holocaust. The Holocaust is by far, and the general behavior of the Nazis is by far the best documented. Japanese atrocities are the second best documented. It's much more difficult to find reliable data on atrocities during colonial wars, for instance. So the British in Kenya fought a very dirty war. There was a lot of torture, a lot of massacre, a lot of imprisonment of people in camps in terrible conditions. But the records of that, of British behaviour have been concealed, have been very difficult to uncover. So, and internal records, Chinese records, Soviet records, the records of repression within independent countries are even more difficult to uncover. So it's absolutely the case that there's a great deal that we don't know about Japanese war crimes, but they are very much better documented than many of the brutalities that took place in that 3-decade period in the middle of the 20th century.
So another question by a participant, why Japan has never officially apologized for the Chinese atrocities as it has done for the South Koreans?
So Japan has apologized many times. The issue is whether the apologies go far enough, whether they're and whether they're sincere. So many Chinese and Koreans will say that as long as war criminals are enshrined in Yasukuni Shrine, which it's a private shrine, but it has a kind of central national role, then any Japanese apology must be insincere. So it's actually a myth that Japan has never apologized. There have been many apologies, but there is a serious question over whether those apologies have been sufficient. In the case of Germany, apologies for the Holocaust began in 1970, but apologies for German war crimes, apart from the Holocaust, didn't begin until much later, didn't begin until the 1990s. Germany has gone further than Japan, but its record is not quite as shining in comparison as is sometimes suggested.
Yes, and also, Professor, just to say a big, no one is from the West now. It's not much bothered about Japan's apology, because even the Western countries such as USA, when it comes to war on terror or the British occupation in Kenya and the African nations, they have. I was reading somewhere the military tactics or the atrocities they had used was similar to Japanese. There has also been this argument.
That's absolutely the case with forms of torture. So one of the common forms of torture used by the Kempeitai was waterboarding. It was known as water torture, water cure, many different names. It's a very effective, relatively low-tech form of torture, and the US has used it. And under George W. Bush, it made the statement that this didn't constitute torture, even though Japanese had been prosecuted and found guilty of torture for doing precisely that.
So before we wrap up today's session, I would like to request our co-host, co-organizer, the Development Study Group, President Reza Hikam, to request him to speak a few words on today's lecture. Reza?
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Singh, and thank you very much, Mr. Masu, for having a collaboration with Development Study Club, or should I say DSC for short. And also thank you very much for Professor Robert Cribb. Back then, DSC have invited you to discuss about your dissertation, but in the meantime, our friend from India, from Calcutta, asked that if there are any academics interested about genocide in Southeast Asia. I came across your name back then, but when I came across your name, I remember your book, if I'm not mistaken, the Indonesian Killings, Studies from Java and Bali, but it is about Indonesian Communist Party. I see that there are more interesting topics about the Japanese war criminal. One of your books was written with some of your colleagues. Now, the discussion today is very interesting indeed, because the Japanese war crimes is, if I may say, one of the most notorious in the 20th century, especially what happens in East Asia and Southeast Asia, just as what they have done in Indonesia or the Philippines. And Professor Robert Cribb also mentioned several problems, such as the Kunjanku or comfort woman, as one of the Japanese war crimes. But there are still many studies about atrocities in Indonesia, like what Aiko Kurosawa wrote about mobilization in Java. There are many Japanese, you call it kuli, unskilled labor native, who are exported to other countries, and only a handful and a tiny scale get back to Indonesia. Most of them died elsewhere. Some of my friends' relatives also died when they are joining Heihu, like auxiliary forces for the Japanese in Indonesia. But the most interesting things, and I hope can give us some, Professor Cribb can give us some enlightenment. There are these atrocities happening in Southeast Asia that give rise to what they call as the Yamashita standard, under the banner of Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya. Maybe this is an epilogue for me and also a question. What is actually the Yamashita standard? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So General Yamashita was the Japanese commander at the time of the or for the invasion of British Malaya and Singapore. He was also the commander in Luzon in the Philippines as the Americans advanced. And as the Americans advanced north through the Philippines, Yamashita retreated into the mountains of the north of Luzon, leaving instructions to his troops not to fight in Manila. Now, they didn't obey that instruction. Instead, the rape of Manila was one of the two worst great atrocities of the Second World War, alongside the rape of Nanjing. So tens of thousands of Filipinos were killed. Tens of thousands of Filipino women were raped in this in the course of a few weeks in the city as the Americans advanced. So after the Japanese surrendered, Yamashita was put on trial in Manila. He was the first person to be tried in the Philippines by the Americans, and he was charged with what was known as command responsibility for what his troops had done in Manila. Now, the idea of command responsibility was a really important doctrine that came out of that United Nations War Crimes Commission. So the idea was that you shouldn't simply punish ordinary soldiers who, for instance, killed a prisoner if they were doing it on orders from above. Very clearly, the commander should be the one who orders the execution should be the one to bear the responsibility for it, rather than the person who simply obeys the orders. And this idea of command responsibility was expanded to include the failure of a commander to control his troops. So it didn't require that a commander order his troops to commit atrocities, but simply that he was the commander, they committed atrocities, and he had failed to control them. So it was on that basis that Yamashita was tried and then found guilty and sentenced to death and hanged. It's called the Yamashita Standard because it set a very high standard. Yamashita had been 100 kilometers away from Manila at the time. He had no means of communicating with the Japanese troops in Manila. Some of them were naval troops who weren't actually under his control, under his authority. And he had ordered his troops to withdraw from the city, and they disobeyed his order. So he was held responsible as commander for what his troops had done. Many people at the time thought that that was not reasonable. Many people thought, this is a really good standard. This means that commanders can't hope to escape responsibility by virtue of the fact that they didn't bother to inform themselves of what was happening. General Matsui Iwane tried the same defense when it came to his responsibility for the Nanjing massacre, and that defense was also rejected. He was he'd been away from Nanjing at the time of the worst massacres, but he was still the commander, and he did nothing to stop it. He did nothing to punish the people who had committed the rape of Nanjing. So the Yamashita standard is a very high standard, which has never been applied again outside the Japanese war crimes, because if it were applied consistently, then commanders all around the world would have been found guilty of atrocities carried out by their own troops. Whether or not they knew about it, whether the issue would have been, did they do everything possible to prevent their troops from doing it? If the answer is no, they're guilty. So British, Dutch, French, American commanders would all be liable to be found guilty if the Yamashita standard were imposed. And of course, the rest of the world realized this, and so they quietly dropped that standard after the end of the trials of Japanese. So Yamashita was also the commander in Singapore at the time of the so-called Sukching massacre, when about 5,000 Chinese were rounded up and executed as potential security risks. So in that particular case, his responsibility for the massacre was much clearer than it was in Manila. But the British were in charge in Singapore, the Americans were in charge in the Philippines, and the Americans wanted to put him on trial, so they did. He wasn't prosecuted by the British, but if he had been, it's very likely he would have been found guilty.
So thank you once again, Professor Cribb, for answering those questions and for such a great presentation. It was our pleasure to have you with us here. And hopefully in future, if your schedule permits, we would like to host you again on similar themes. So this concludes our webinar today. It's great that we met today to explore this topic. And thank you all for attending. And I'm sure that everyone has learned and enjoyed this amazing lecture. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor.